Details has called the work intense.
You have some questions for me. I'm going to start with the prologue. If Jack Johnson had let James Jeffries beat him on July 4th, 1910, which would have proven once and for all that a white man was 10 times better than a Negro, then black folk wouldn't have been walking around with their backs straight and chests puffed out, smiling like Cheshire cats, upsetting good, God-fearing white folk who didn't mind seeing their Negroes happy, but didn't like seeing them proud. If Jack Johnson had given up and allowed James Jeffries to clip him on the chin, which would have sent him hurling down to the floor, where he could have pretended to be knocked out cold, then maybe Easter Bartlett's father wouldn't have twirled his wife and daughters around the house by their pinky fingers, and his son, John Bartlett Jr., wouldn't have felt for the first time in his life pleased and glad to be a black man. And if Jack Johnson had let the shouts of "kill that nigger" that rang out from the crowd unravel him, or the Nevada heat to irritate him, maybe then he would have lost the fight and things would have remained as they were. Things could have gone a different way if Jack Johnson had gotten a notion some years earlier to cap his teeth in gold, so his smile added insult to injury when he was announced the victor of the fight of the century, and that glittering grin slapped white folk hard across their faces. And if John Bartlett Sr. hadn't bet on Jack Johnson to win, then he wouldn't have had the extra money to buy his wife and 2 daughters new dresses from the most expensive dress shop in town, and the older of the 2 girls, called R. Elizabeth, wouldn't have let her hair down and don that brand new yellow dress that made her look like an angel, so the white boys wouldn't have noticed her, wouldn't have called out to her from across the road, wouldn't have followed her and jumped her just as she reached the bend and dragged her into the brush where they raped and beat her. And if all of that hadn't happened, then Easter wouldn't have looked up to see her sister crawling home on all 4s like a dog, with a bloodstain shaped like the state of Texas on the backside of R. Elizabeth's dress. Easter wouldn't have bore witness to the bite marks on R. Elizabeth's breast, and wouldn't have heard the silence that streamed out of R. Elizabeth's mouth when she opened it to scream, no sound at all. Because after the first boy rammed his dick inside of R. Elizabeth, her voice floated up into the sky, never to be heard from again, and Easter wouldn't have had to accompany John Sr. down to the sheriff's office because her mother wouldn't let him go alone and couldn't send John Jr. because that boy hadn't unclenched his fists or his jaw since it happened, and besides, blood was swimming in his irises, and he claimed to hear it thumping in his ears. So Easter went and then watched her father change from a man to a boy right before her very eyes. And if Sheriff Wiley had not forced Easter and her father to stare at the filthy soles of his boots because it had not suited him to remove his feet from atop the wooden desk, and if Wiley had looked them straight in the eye like he would have his own kind, instead of watching them from beneath the shade of the wide-brimmed hat he wore, and maybe if he'd believed John Sr. when he said, "I knows it was those white boys, 'cause we found tufts of blonde and red hair clutched in our Elizabeth's hands," and Wiley had just gone out and found those boys and arrested them instead of suggesting that our Elizabeth had torn her own dress and bit her own breast and broke her own hymen, all in order to cover up the somewhere or someone she had no place being or seeing, then maybe life for Easter would have been different. But Wiley didn't do the right thing, and Easter looked up at her father, who sat next to her with his head bowed, and she heard his timid voice say, "Yes, sir, I suppose you could be right, but how do you explain the hair, the red and blonde hair?" Wiley said he couldn't explain it, and then dismissed them by tugging the brim of his hat down over his face and bid them a good day. If he hadn't done that, and Easter hadn't seen the tears welling up in her father's eyes, she wouldn't have turned into the snarling, howling thing, and her father wouldn't have caught her by the waist, just as she leapt across the desk, intent on tearing out Wiley's throat. And if Jack Johnson hadn't been quite so dark, and hadn't pumped his fists in the air like the champion he was, then maybe. If our Elizabeth had just put on one of the old, worn dresses she owned and kept her hair pulled back in a tight bun, Easter probably never would have written the word hate on a piece of paper, crumbled it into a ball, dropped it into a hole in the ground, and covered it with dirt. And her mother wouldn't have tried to go back to living as if that awful day hadn't happened and those boys weren't walking around as free as birds. And she never would have had the strain of pretending that everything was normal, even though our Elizabeth had lost her voice, and John Jr. had taken to staring down every white man in the town, and John Sr. was intent on trying to make himself grow big again, and thought that taking refuge in the arms of another woman would help him do that. And if Zelda hadn't found the love letters pressed into the pages of her husband's Bible, letters written on fine onion skin paper that smelled of rose water, and then John Jr. wouldn't have caught her crying, wouldn't have seen the letters scattered on the floor, and wouldn't have hit his father so hard that it knocked the wind out of both men. If all of that hadn't happened, then John Jr. wouldn't have had to leave the house, the town, and the state. And Easter might have gone on loving and respecting her father, but it did, and Zelda's heart snapped under the strain, pain, and betrayal, and she died. And if there had not been a funeral, there would not have been a repast, so there would have been no need for Easter's father to wait patiently for the last mourner to leave the house before he changed his clothes, mounted his horse, and galloped off into the night, leaving the scent of his pipe tobacco hanging in the air. And if he hadn't left, then he couldn't have returned with a wide-eyed, milky brown woman who smelled of rose water and wasn't much older than our Elizabeth. He couldn't have brought her into their home, told Easter and our Elizabeth her name, which was Truda, and then informed them that she was his new wife and their new mother. If Jack Johnson had just thrown the fight, and our Elizabeth had maybe walked down a different road and not have been so pretty, everything would have remained the same in their small home, and Easter would not have known the aching sadness of a dead mother, gone brother, and mute and ruined sister. And if there was no ache and no sadness, then Easter would not have taken the gown that her mother died in, laid it across the dining room table, and arranged the china, crystal, and silverware with the scrolled handles on top of it as if it was a special holiday and the family were expecting dinner guests. And she would not have placed bunches of flowers at the neckline, hemline, and sleeve, but she did. And when Truda walked into the dining room the next morning, she forgot to breathe. And if Truda hadn't forgotten to breathe, then maybe she wouldn't have screamed, which of course brought John Sr. into the room to see what was the matter. After that, he kicked in the door to Easter's bedroom and found her sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at her palms. He charged in and loomed over her like a great black hawk and hollered that he should have drowned her at birth. And if he hadn't said those hurtful words, Easter would have stayed in Waycross, Georgia, married, had children, grown old, and died. But on that day, in 1910, Jack Johnson did beat James Jeffries, and our Elizabeth did put on that yellow dress that made her look like an angel, and nothing and nobody was ever the same again. So that's the opening. This one last part I'm going to read is just a favorite of mine. It's about Otabanga, which was a pygmy that was brought to America and placed in a zoo. A lot of people don't know about this part of our history. And I'm starting in the middle, so it's going to sound a little weird. Colin took her hand and practically dragged her through the arched gates of the zoo. They sped past the caged sea lions, the sleeping leopards, the yawning tigers, and the cages filled with chattering rainbow-colored birds until they found themselves at the entrance of the monkey house. Easter opened her mouth, a question balanced on her tongue, but Colin raised a finger to her lips. Once they were inside, his grip tightened around her hand as he edged his way through the throng of fascinated onlookers. Easter could see bright orange fur and huge droopy eyes pressed into an elongated face. An orangutan. He brought me all this way to see an orangutan. They moved closer until they were right up front, and Easter found herself staring at a man who gazed back at her from the opposite side of the metal bars. She thought her mind was playing a cruel trick on her eyes, but when she blinked, he was still there. The orangutan threw his arms around the man's shoulders and hugged him. The man hugged him back and then shrugged him off. The white people laughed, and some of them hunched their backs, pushed out their bottom lips, and made whooping monkey sounds. Easter's eyes roamed to the sign posted on the enclosure. The African pygmy Ota Benga, age 28, height 4 feet 11 inches, Congo Free State, South Central Africa, by Dr. Samuel P. Berner. The natural emotion should have been anger and embarrassment, but all Easter wanted to do was cry. She looked up at her husband, and her eyes asked what her mouth wouldn't. Why did you bring me here? Ota Benga was naked except for a loincloth, and as was the custom of his people, his teeth had been filed to sharp and precise points. In his hand he held a child's bow and arrow, which he trained first on the orangutan and then squarely on the crowd. Some of the male onlookers clutched their chests and stumbled backwards on the heels of their expensive leather shoes, crying, "Ow, you got me." The ladies twirled their parasols and giggled behind their hands encased in delicately embroidered gloves as they watched their children toss peanuts through the bars, even though there was a sign that read, "Please do not feed the animals." Ota Benga spotted Easter and Colin, the only two dark faces in the sea of white, and pleasure spread across his face in a smile. He rushed excitedly up to the front of the cage, wrapped his fingers around the bars, and proudly announced, "I am man." Thank you. So this is my first full-fledged historical novel, and I think that now I've finally found my calling, and this is all that I want to do going forward. I've been inching my way to this point, and now that I'm here, I'm really enjoying it, and I already have 2 new novels in my head that I would really like to start working on if I could stop marketing. So.
Good luck with that.
Yeah. So, hello everybody. Some new faces, some faces that I've been seeing for the past 10 years.